There is a readout sitting on the Prime Minister's website right now. Most people scrolled past it in under 3 seconds, buried in the kind of diplomatic language deliberately designed to put you to sleep. Close coordination, shared economic priorities, mutual prosperity. But hidden inside that bureaucratic fog is a single detail that is blowing apart everything Trump's trade war machine has been quietly building for the past 18 months. Canada made the call, not Mexico. Canada picked up the phone and dialed Mexico City first. That one fact, who initiated, who reached out, who moved first, tells you more about the current state of North American trade politics than every tariff announcement you will read this week combined. And Washington? Washington did not see this coming. Here is exactly why that matters, and why it matters right now. For the past 18 months, since January of 2025, Washington has been running a cold, calculated, and deliberately engineered strategy. Keep Canada and Mexico sitting at separate tables. Negotiate bilaterally. Use each country's desperation as a weapon against the other. Divide and conquer. Textbook trade war tactics. And here is the part that should make your stomach drop. It was working. Until last week. Mark Carney just quietly detonated a signal, wrapped inside the most carefully worded diplomatic language possible, that Canada is done playing Washington's isolation game alone. I am going to show you exactly what was said, what was deliberately left unsaid, and what the next 60 days will reveal about whether this signal is a genuine strategic earthquake or just carefully staged theater. Because right now, the answer to that question is worth billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of jobs across North America. For 18 months, Canada and Mexico have been living trapped inside the exact same economic storm. Same steel tariffs, same aluminum tariffs, same punishing auto tariffs. Two countries with decades of deeply integrated supply chains, treated not as the closest and most loyal trading partners the United States has ever had, but as expendable variables in a cold pressure calculation designed in Washington. And yet, despite sharing that identical painful reality, these two countries spent most of that time barely speaking to each other in any meaningful strategic sense. No coordination, no common position, no joint pushback. According to reporting from the Globe and Mail, a senior Mexican official described the exchanges between Ottawa and Mexico City during this entire period as little more than pleasantries. No joint strategy, no aligned response, no shared front. That stunning absence of coordination did not happen by accident, and it absolutely did not go unnoticed inside Washington. In fact, Washington was counting on it. Here is where the two countries began moving in completely opposite directions, and this is the part that most coverage has gotten dangerously wrong by treating these two situations as equivalent. In December of 2025, Mexico made a significant and deliberate policy move. Sheinbaum's government imposed tariffs of up to 50% on hundreds of product categories imported from China: steel, automobiles, footwear. Analysts in Washington read this immediately as a calculated alignment signal. Mexico was telling the Trump administration, without ever saying it directly, "We share your concern about Chinese market access flooding into North America. We are adjusting. Now give us a deal." The response from Washington was immediate and measurable. The United States extended deadlines for Mexico. Carve-outs were quietly offered to Mexico that were never offered to Canada. By the time spring of 2026 arrived, one detailed analysis of the tariff structure revealed that Mexico was operating under a significantly lower effective tariff burden than Canada across several critical categories. That gap is not symbolic. It is not just a talking point. It is commercial reality landing right now on every single manufacturer making sourcing decisions today. Canada moved in the exact opposite direction. Ottawa finalized an arrangement allowing approximately 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles to enter Canada at a 6% tariff rate, alongside agricultural trade flowing the other direction. From Washington's perspective, this looked like Canada deliberately doubling down on the exact economic architecture the Trump administration has been publicly and aggressively arguing against since day one. Two countries. Same starting position. completely divergent strategies. And here is the brutal consequence that nobody in Washington was even slightly subtle about. By March of 2026, United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer had met personally with Sheinbaum in Mexico City. He sat down with Mexican Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard. Formal trilateral review talks had a confirmed scheduled start date. Mexico was at the table. Canada, as of that same period, did not have an official start date for formal negotiations. Read that again slowly. The largest single trading relationship the United States has, by some measures, Canada, was sitting further back in the queue than Mexico. That is the brutal strategic landscape Mark Carney was staring at when he picked up that phone at the end of April 2026. Not a position of strength, a position that demanded a completely different kind of move. Fast. Now here is where most analysis simply stops. The mainstream narrative writes itself too cleanly. Mexico is winning, Canada is losing. Washington is expertly managing both, neat, containable, predictable. But look much more carefully at what Carney and Sheinbaum actually discussed on that call. Because the official readout did not just say trade, it listed 4 specific areas of dramatically expanded cooperation: critical minerals, clean technology, energy, advanced manufacturing. Those are not random topics pulled from some tired diplomatic boilerplate library. Those are 4 of the most structurally explosive pressure points in the entire North American economic architecture, and I want to take them apart one at a time, because each one carries a geopolitical weight that the headline coverage has completely and dangerously missed. Start with critical minerals. The United States currently depends on imports for a significant share of the minerals on its own critical minerals list, materials that are absolutely essential for defense technology, semiconductor manufacturing, and the entire energy transition. Canada holds enormous reserves. Mexico holds others. Neither country has been fully developed as a supply chain partner for these materials at the scale Washington now desperately needs. If Ottawa and Mexico City begin formally coordinating their critical mineral strategy, export terms, processing agreements, pricing frameworks, they are not just talking economics. They are assembling leverage that has never existed in consolidated form before. Leverage that Washington cannot simply ignore or negotiate away bilaterally. That is not a side conversation. That is a potential checkmate move being quietly assembled right now. Move to energy. Canadian oil from Alberta moves through pipelines that directly feed American refineries. Mexican refining capacity serves markets that American energy policy depends on remaining stable. The integration here is not theoretical. It is operational and deeply embedded. Any serious disruption in Canada-Mexico energy coordination does not politely stay north of the border. It travels south, fast, directly into American gasoline prices, into industrial input costs, into the kind of economic pain that shows up immediately in polling data. Washington understands this, which is exactly why the prospect of coordinated Canada-Mexico energy positioning is being watched so nervously inside the Beltway right now. Now look at advanced manufacturing, and the auto sector specifically. A vehicle assembled in Michigan or Ohio is not built from parts that crossed one border once. Industry analyses have estimated that components in a finished North American automobile can cross the Canada-United States or Mexico-United States border multiple times before final assembly is complete. Every single tariff application on every single crossing compounds the cost. When manufacturers cannot model their input costs with any confidence 3 months forward, they do not sit back and absorb that uncertainty. They act. They delay. They relocate planning cycles. They shrink order commitments. That behavioral shift is already happening in real time across parts of Ontario right now. It does not make flashy front-page headlines. It shows up quietly in quarterly earnings calls and in conversations between plant managers and the workforce schedulers trying to figure out how many people to keep on next month. And clean technology. China currently dominates the global supply chain for battery components, solar panels, and multiple categories of electric vehicle manufacturing. Both Canada and Mexico are being actively positioned by their own governments and by outside investors as alternative sourcing options for manufacturers desperate to reduce their China exposure. If they coordinate that positioning jointly, rather than competing against each other for the same pool of investment dollars, the combined offer becomes dramatically more attractive. That is not a small shift. That is potentially redirecting hundreds of billions in global manufacturing investment, and it happens outside Washington's direct control. Here is the single most important analytical point I need you to hold tightly right now. USTR Greer has publicly described his preferred negotiating architecture using the phrase snap-on Lego structure, meaning the trilateral framework of the existing trade agreement remains nominally intact on paper, but all the real substantive negotiations happen bilaterally. United States with Mexico, United States with Canada, separately, isolated, divided. Carney has publicly and directly rejected that framework. He has stated clearly that sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber must be addressed within the broader trade agreement context, not carved out and negotiated piecemeal on Washington's preferred timetable. Those are two directly and completely incompatible positions. There is no middle ground between them. And the phone call to Sheinbaum was Carney's attempt, urgent, calculated, and historically significant, to find out whether Mexico would stand on the same side of that fundamental disagreement, or whether Mexico would quietly accept Washington's bilateral architecture and leave Canada to negotiate completely alone. That answer is not yet confirmed, but the fact that the call happened at all is the first variable that Washington's meticulously constructed strategy did not fully price in. And that is what is making people in Washington nervous right now. Let me translate something critical for you, because this is exactly where the real analysis begins. The official readout from the Prime Minister's office described the Carney-Sheinbaum call as, and I am quoting directly here, an opportunity to discuss close coordination on shared economic priorities in the context of ongoing trade challenges. 17 words. Completely opaque. Professionally engineered to communicate nothing that could be reported as a firm commitment. Here is what that language actually means when you read it the way a seasoned diplomat reads it. Close coordination means we are not currently coordinating closely, and we are publicly acknowledging that gap without formally admitting it was a strategic failure. Shared economic priorities means we have identified that our interests overlap enough to justify having a real conversation, but we have not yet agreed on what to actually do about it. Ongoing trade challenges means the tariffs are still there. Neither of us has solved them, and neither of us is pretending otherwise. That readout is not a declaration of alliance. It is not a victory announcement. It is a door being carefully opened. Nothing more. And the reason that distinction matters enormously is because the temptation in coverage like this is to read the phone call as a resolution. It is not. It is the first move in a negotiation about whether to negotiate together. And that is actually the bigger story. Now let me decode the three key actors in this story, because each one has a completely different and sometimes contradictory set of incentives driving their behavior right now. Start with Carney. He enters this situation from a position of clear structural disadvantage. Canada does not have a confirmed start date for formal trade negotiations with Washington. Mexico does. That asymmetry is not just symbolically embarrassing. It means that every single week that passes without a Canadian seat at the formal negotiating table is a week during which the terms being shaped in Washington are being shaped entirely without Canadian input. Carney's leverage calculation is therefore not, how do I negotiate with Washington from a position of strength? It is, how do I avoid negotiating with Washington from a position of complete and total isolation? The call to Sheinbaum is best understood as an urgent attempt to change that calculation entirely, to introduce a variable that makes Canada structurally harder to isolate and impossible to ignore. Whether it succeeds depends almost entirely on what Sheinbaum decides to do next. Now decode Sheinbaum. She is sitting in a genuinely more comfortable position, and she knows it. Mexico arrived at the formal negotiating table first. Mexico has a confirmed timeline. Mexico has already clearly demonstrated to Washington through the December 2025 tariff adjustment on Chinese goods a concrete willingness to align on the issues Washington cares most deeply about. Sheinbaum's response to Carney's call was described publicly as warm. She agreed to assign senior officials to identify concrete cooperation areas. She accepted the May trade mission to Canadian cities. But warm is not committed. In diplomatic terms, agreeing to send officials to explore possible cooperation is the absolute lowest cost possible response to a call like this. It keeps every door open without committing to walking through any of them. Sheinbaum is not going to publicly embrace a full Canada-Mexico strategic axis if doing so risks irritating Washington during the most sensitive and consequential phase of her own negotiation timeline. She is expertly managing multiple high-stakes relationships simultaneously, and right now, the relationship with Washington is worth considerably more to her in concrete, measurable terms than the relationship with Ottawa. Anyone telling you otherwise is not reading this situation clearly. Now decode Washington. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick spent considerable public time in recent weeks openly criticizing Canada's strategic direction, describing the Chinese electric vehicle arrangement as economically counterproductive and characterizing Canada's entire approach as dangerously misaligned with American priorities. That level of sharp public rhetoric from a cabinet secretary directed at America's single closest trading partner is not standard diplomatic friction. It is a deliberately loud signal of genuine and deep frustration. But here is the detail that matters far more than any public statement. Sources in Washington were reportedly specifically displeased by the Carney-Sheinbaum call because it represented precisely the scenario the entire current trade strategy was architected to prevent. A coordinated response, a joint position, two separate counterparties refusing to remain conveniently separate. The Lego architecture strategy only works if all the pieces stay permanently detached. The moment Canada and Mexico begin moving as even a loosely connected unit, even informally, even just across the four sectors identified on that call, the bilateral pressure model loses a massive portion of its structural logic. And Washington knows it. And now the piece of recent history that almost nobody is covering adequately. And that makes this entire situation dramatically more complicated than the clean narrative suggests. Earlier in this trade dispute, the Premier of Ontario publicly floated the idea of reconsidering Mexico's position within the trade framework, essentially signaling that Canada might be willing to accept terms that directly disadvantaged Mexico in exchange for better treatment from Washington. Trump did not accept that offer, but Mexico City registered it immediately. That moment created a genuine and lasting layer of strategic mistrust between Ottawa and Mexico City that Carney's team has had to actively work against ever since. Last week's phone call was, among other things, Canada explicitly acknowledging that the earlier approach of treating Mexico as expendable was both strategically catastrophic and diplomatically toxic. Whether Mexico accepts that acknowledgement as sufficient foundation to build real coordination, that is the question the next 30 days will begin to decisively answer. Let me bring this down to ground level right now, because everything described so far happens in carefully secured meeting rooms, on encrypted calls, in language so deliberately constructed that most people never feel its real weight. But the weight is real, and it is landing on specific people in specific places across North America right now, today. Start with an auto parts supplier in Windsor, Ontario. This is not a hypothetical. The Windsor-Detroit corridor is one of the most commercially integrated border crossings on the entire planet. Manufacturers on both sides of that border have built their entire production schedules around the bedrock assumption that components move freely and predictably across that crossing every single day. When tariff structures become unstable, when a purchasing manager cannot model input costs 3 months forward with any meaningful confidence, the immediate first response is not to absorb the uncertainty stoically. The first response is to reduce commitment. Shorter order cycles, smaller batch sizes, delayed expansion decisions shelved indefinitely. That behavioral shift is already showing up in real order book data across Southern Ontario manufacturing operations right now. It does not make front-page headlines. It shows up in quarterly earnings calls and in difficult conversations between plant managers and workforce schedulers trying to figure out what next month looks like. Now move to a home builder in Calgary or Vancouver. Softwood lumber from British Columbia has faced sustained tariff pressure in the American market for years. But the current environment has added a sharp new layer of uncertainty that is compressing margins across the entire construction supply chain with brutal efficiency. When lumber export revenues face serious downward pressure, the cost adjustment does not politely stay at the mill. It moves through every layer of the supply chain like a shockwave. And in housing markets already operating under severe and well-documented affordability constraints, additional cost pressure on construction inputs is not a distant abstraction. It is the direct difference between a housing project proceeding and a housing project being permanently shelved while families wait. Now consider the agricultural dimension, Nadine, because this is where the human reality of this trade war becomes impossible to ignore. Canadian canola moves south. Mexican produce moves north. American grain moves in multiple directions across both borders every single day. These are not small incidental flows. These are the integrated supply chains that stock grocery shelves and determine farm income across 3 countries. Every single month of tariff uncertainty extends the planning horizon that agricultural businesses are forced to operate under. Farmers cannot plant based on tariff rates that might change drastically before harvest arrives. Processors cannot sign supply agreements when input costs are subject to policy decisions that have not yet been made and might never be made predictably. The uncertainty itself is a direct and measurable cost. And that cost is distributed across every participant in the chain, from the farmer to the processor to the grocery store to the family standing in the aisle staring at prices that keep climbing. Here is the contrast that makes this situation genuinely and uncomfortably complicated to analyze in clean terms. The Canadian arrangement allowing Chinese electric vehicles to enter at a 6% tariff rate creates a direct and concrete benefit for a specific group of Canadian consumers, people who want access to lower-cost electric vehicles currently priced entirely out of their financial range. That is a real benefit to real families. At the exact same time, that same arrangement creates significant competitive pressure on North American electric vehicle manufacturers already navigating an extraordinarily difficult industrial transition period. One policy decision, 2 legitimate, opposing, and irreconcilable sets of real consequences. Anyone presenting this to you as simple is not giving you the complete picture. They are giving you a talking point. And then there is the World Cup. And this is the factor that absolutely nobody is giving sufficient weight. Canada, the United States, and Mexico are co-hosting the FIFA World Cup beginning in the summer of 2026. Matches will be played in cities across all 3 countries. Heads of state will share stages in front of global audiences. Cameras will be everywhere, broadcasting to billions. The diplomatic optics of that shared moment, whatever state the underlying trade relationship is in by then, will be completely impossible to quietly manage. Both Ottawa and Mexico City are acutely aware that the period between right now and the opening match represents a critical window during which neither side wants to be seen by a global audience as the party that escalated a trade war between co-host nations. That political awareness does not resolve the underlying disputes or make the tariffs disappear, but it does create a real and powerful practical incentive to keep communication channels open and to aggressively avoid the kind of explosive public confrontation that would force Washington to respond publicly and forcefully in kind. The World Cup deadline is not a solution, but it is a forcing function, and it is coming fast. The trade war is not an abstraction being debated in comfortable think tanks. It is a set of crushing real constraints landing on real balance sheets right now, across industries that employ hundreds of thousands of people on both sides of every border in this story. So where exactly does this go from here? Let me give you 3 concrete scenarios, not predictions, because anyone offering you certainty about North American trade politics in May of 2026 is either delusional or selling something. These are scenarios, and the difference between them is enormous. Scenario 1, the coordination is real, and it holds. The Mexican trade delegation lands in Canadian cities this month as scheduled. Economy ministers on both sides begin coordinating publicly, not just in carefully worded readouts, but in joint public statements, in aligned positions at the trilateral review table, in shared frameworks built around the 4 specific sectors identified on that call. If that happens, the bilateral pressure architecture Washington has been carefully constructing loses its most critical structural assumption. Canada and Mexico are no longer 2 separate, isolated negotiating problems that can be played against each other. They become one connected, coordinated variable. That does not automatically guarantee better outcomes for either country, but it fundamentally and irreversibly changes the geometry of the entire negotiation. Washington would be forced to recalculate immediately. Scenario 2. Mexico quietly moves toward its own deal. Sheinbaum keeps the May mission warm and diplomatically visible. She assigns officials to the coordination process. She maintains the carefully crafted public appearance of alignment with Ottawa, while simultaneously accelerating her own bilateral timeline with Washington behind closed doors. This is not cynical. This is entirely rational behavior. Mexico arrived at the table first. Mexico has substantially more to lose strategically by slowing its own momentum than by moving forward and closing its own deal. If a bilateral agreement with genuinely favorable terms is available to Mexico before Canada arrives at a comparable negotiating position, the incentive to wait for Canadian coordination simply and completely disappears. In this scenario, Carney's call last week was diplomatically received with warmth and strategically irrelevant to Mexico's actual decision-making calculus. Scenario 3. The World Cup creates a temporary ceiling on escalation. All three governments find it politically unsustainable to publicly escalate trade hostilities during a period of extraordinary shared international visibility and global media scrutiny. The summer of 2026 becomes a de facto pause in active hostilities. Substantive negotiations resume in the fall with all the same underlying structural dynamics fully intact, but with a potential reset in tone that creates political space for a fundamentally different kind of conversation. Not a solution, but a reset. And sometimes a reset is what changes everything. Here is the single variable I am watching most closely over the next 30 days. And it is not a summit announcement, not a press conference, not a dramatic public declaration. It is whether Marcelo Ebrard, Mexico's economy minister, begins making public statements that explicitly reference and validate Canadian coordination. If he does, Scenario 1 is alive and the trade war calculus shifts dramatically. If his public positioning remains exclusively and carefully bilateral with Washington, Scenario 2 becomes the far more likely read. Watch Ebrard, not the readouts, not the photo opportunities. Ebrard's public language in the next 30 days will tell you everything you need to know about whether what happened on that phone call was a historic strategic turning point or a very expensive piece of diplomatic theater. The trade war is no longer simply about tariff rates on steel or aluminum or automobiles. It has become something bigger and more consequential. It is about whether two of the most important economic partners the United States has ever had can do something that, until very recently, neither of them seemed willing or able to do. Stand in the same room at the same time with a shared position, and refuse to be divided. I want to know exactly what you think right now. Is Sheinbaum building something genuinely real and lasting with Carney? Or is this carefully managed diplomatic courtesy, while Mexico quietly closes its own separate deal with Washington? Tell me directly in the comments below, and if you want the full update the moment that Mexican delegation lands in Toronto, you already know what you need to do.